Thank you all for joining us today for another episode of our podcast, Moving to Value Unscripted. My name is Dr. John Rodas, and I'm a recovering ex-hospital president and am proud to be the president of the Moving to Value Alliance. The Moving to Value Alliance, MTVA, a 501c3 nonprofit, is a multi-stakeholder grassroots organization whose purpose, put simply, is to foster a community that aims to create a value-based healthcare ecosystem with high-quality outcomes at a reasonable cost for plan sponsors and their members, beneficiaries, or employees. Our community has grown substantially over the past few years. We started in Connecticut, but now have nearly 1,000 stakeholders from more than 40 states all over the U.S. I want to thank our members who make this presentation possible. We'd like to give special recognition today to our trade member, Hartford Healthcare. I'm joined today by my fellow board members, Lisa Trumbull and Dr. Steve Schutzer. Lisa Trumbull is the CEO of Sohn Health, Southern New England Healthcare Organization, a physician-led, clinically integrated delivery system in Connecticut and Massachusetts. Dr. Steve Schutzer, a nationally renowned arthroplasty surgeon, is one of the founders of MTVA and is the co-founder and president of Upswing Health. Our special guest today is Pramod John. Pramod is the chairman and CEO of Vivio Health, a public benefit corporation that's using data to disrupt the typical PBM model. Vivio's goal is straightforward: to deliver the right drug for the right patient at the right price. Their approach embraces transparency and personalization in order to deliver lower costs, better outcomes, and enhanced compliance. Pramod brings a particular broad and diverse collection of experience to the healthcare innovation space. Before founding Vivio, he started Oration, a software that helped patients find the best prices for their prescriptions from their phones. Oration is now owned by the United Health Group subsidiary Change Healthcare. He also led companies across a variety of industries and holds a PhD in electrical engineering from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. We're excited to have Pramod here today to discuss the business of healthcare and what value looks like. Welcome to Moving to Value Unscripted, Pramod.
Thank you very much, John. It's great to be here.
So, Pramod, thank you for being here. Really, our listeners and frankly, my colleagues have always been intrigued by how people the journey they've taken to get to where they are, and in some cases, some singular event in their backstory that leads them to the healthcare world, and in other cases, a little more of a winding road. And I'm trying to figure out how an electrical engineer. I used to play poker with a lot of electrical engineers at college, and I can't imagine any of them are doing healthcare today. So I'm trying to figure out how you managed to get from that space into the healthcare value space in general, and then the drug cost part in particular.
Well, John, I don't know, because you used to play poker with electrical engineers. My wife says that I have a terrible poker face. And so I don't know whether to interpret that as maybe I should do something other than electrical engineering as a result of that if they were successful, those other engineers. But either way, I started out I did some ventures in the computer security space. So I started out in the tech space. And after some exits in that space, I decided I wanted to work on something that was a large-scale national social problem. And I came to the conclusion that healthcare was our biggest sort of social problem, if you will, as a country. And it was fascinating. I ended up working at McKesson, a large healthcare company, and most people have heard the name before. And it was one of those fascinating experiences because, when I went in, like a lot of people going into these industries, imagine you're a physician. As a physician, you go into healthcare saying, I want to make healthcare better. So you do your job better. And you think that by doing your job, you're going to make healthcare better. And then, of course, in the same way, as an outsider being from the tech space, I'm thinking, hey, healthcare has got, tech. We can bring technology to healthcare, and that's going to help solve these problems. And by doing technology better for healthcare will result in a better system, lower costs, better outcomes, all these things. And then probably no differently than most physicians have recognized in their career, as they've done their job better, all that meant was that prices still went up every year. And for most Americans, we still ended up with less for more year over year, right? And in the same vein, we saw the same thing as we start building all of these new technologies and other things, new innovations in healthcare. The same thing happened in those spaces too. What we ended up with was higher costs every year, not really any improvements when we think about global quality metrics and other things. And so it was a fascinating experience because what it really showed me was that this isn't a technology problem, and this ultimately isn't about healthcare knowledge. When you think about a physician, for example, right? You think about sort of what you do as a physician every day. You want to understand clinical things, you want to understand data, you want to be able to serve your patients better. And it's always focused on how do I do what I do better, right? Especially the great physicians out there who are always looking at how I do my job better.
Mhm.
And you see this disconnect between you doing your job better, but it doesn't translate to lower costs. And that was when we realized, wow, this seems to be about not health care quality per se. It has to do with the business of healthcare. And those two things are very different. And that was sort of the rude awakening when I was at McKesson of realizing that this wasn't a technology problem. This wasn't a clinical problem. This was really about we've got a broken market in many ways around the healthcare system problem.
Yeah, well, none of us are going to argue with that. It's not really, and we've said it many times in the show, it's not really a free market. The free market that, Michael Porter and Elizabeth Teisberg imagined in redefining healthcare. But we look at the total healthcare spend. I think our listeners are pretty savvy on this now. They know that for any particular employer, anywhere between 30 to 50% of the spend is on pharmaceuticals, and only a handful of drugs often account for almost half of that, especially in the specialty pharma space. So how did you segue into it? Was those facts that made you say, well, that looks like a big nut to crack? Why don't we get into that space?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. So when you think about just one, let's talk about one aggregate stat for a second. Let's build a sort of 30,000 foot view down. Americans are about 4% of the world's population. And at some point, you're like, wow, you realize that we're sort of a rounding error, right? That means that 96% of the world's population does not live in the United States, right? But we spend almost as much on healthcare as the 96% of the world's population put together. If that isn't a bipartisan, I'm angry statement, or fact, I don't know what else is going to get you up in arms
Yeah,
about the fact that
yeah.
we
The thing,
spend as much as 96% of the world's population put together, right? So, like you said, John, if you start talking about drugs, you also find some really interesting facts. Most of the time when we think about drugs, we think about drugs. But it turns out drugs also aren't just drugs. If you break down drugs, let's talk about some categories for a second. About 2 or 3 weeks ago, AAM, which is Association for Accessible Medications, just put out a report that said that 90% of the scripts that are filled in the United States annually, as of this year, only account for 13% of our spend. And this 90% are the categories of generics and biosimilars. So if we took all generics, all biosimilars, they account for 90% of the fills that Americans fill. So out of 6 billion fills a year, that's roughly 5.4 out of 6 billion fills only accounts for 13% of our drug spend.
wow.
That is mind-boggling. And here's the other crazy factor about it. We could probably give away that 90% because we don't need all the infrastructure to give it away. The manufacturers who sell that would make more money and we would spend less, probably half as much, just to give away 9 out of 10 scripts to every American.
Reason.
Now, the other 87% of that, let's talk about that for a second. And you brought up that stat, John, which is it's actually closer to about 55% of our total spend right now in drugs is for about 2% of fills, account for about 55% of the spend. And so when you think about it, those are the specialty drugs. These are the rheumatology, oncology, MS, a lot of these drugs that we see. By the way, most of the time, until the new weight loss drugs became popularized, the GLP-1s over the last about year and a half, every commercial that you saw on TV was generally for a specialty drug.
Right.
So if you saw a commercial on TV then that probably fell into the category of that being used by a small percentage of the population and accounting for about 55% of drug spend. And so when
Wow.
you think about those things, the spend is very concentrated. And so the way to think about it is that we spend way too much on those small numbers of drugs, and we spend probably too little, which is why we're running into, those generics are only 13% for 90% of the scripts. If you do the math, you realize, wow, these things are really, on an average script basis, pretty inexpensive. That's also what's leading to things like shorts. These things have become so cheap because of pressure from the GPOs, for example, that exert pressure on these GPOs that sit in the middle on the manufacturers of these cheap generic drugs. they're finding it better just to get out of the business and stop making large classes of drugs. So not only are these drugs extremely important from a public health perspective, we're finding shorts and other things because manufacturers don't want to make them because we're paying them too little for those inexpensive drugs to where it's not profitable anymore to do it.
Wow.
Wow. Hey, Pramod, first let me thank you for coming on the podcast today. I think you and I met in 2018 at our first or second symposium here in Hartford when we both had less gray hair. Don't know what happened, Pramod. It's gotten very gray, stress. But what always intrigued me is pharma-related speakers. They have their own language, AWAC and this whack, and it gives you a migraine. We've always loved your approach because, John and I, and I know Lisa as well, we're very aligned with Porter and Kaplan, right? That's how orthopedic surgeons think. Outcomes that matter over the true cost. And you're the only one that we know of that approaches a problem in that way, that aligns an outcome for the patient over the true cost of producing that outcome. How did you ever figure that out?
Well, I think it comes from a little bit of, from the perspective of being an engineer, going back to the engineering question. Engineering is about facts and data, right? And part of our problem is that I don't think that most of our conversations today as a country have anything to do with facts and data. And so part of the struggle there is that, John, you talked in the preamble about our sort of focus on the right drug for the right person at the right price, right? Now, you guys are all nodding your head. By the way, you could be speaking to every non-clinical person in America, and if you said, hey, drugs and why we pay for drugs is because we want to get, people better. It's about the outcome. It's about the right drug for the right person at the right price. Everybody nods their head. That's not hard to understand, right? There's no rocket science or you don't have to be a clinician. And you're like, yeah, that makes sense, right? But then the question is, well, how do we figure out what the right drug for the right person and the right price is, right? Because that's the really interesting question. Well, how would one figure that out? And so if you step back for a second and ask, all right, let's talk about the right drug for a second. What defines the right drug? If you sit back for a second, it's like it's the drug's data that defines what the right drug is. So for example, does my opinion have any sort of impact on a drug's data? Is it going to change a drug's data? Does your opinion matter? Is it going to change a drug's data? Does, another doctor who's looking at it or someone who's working on a formulary at a PBM, is their view of the data going to change a drug's data? And it's like, no, it's an invariant factor, right? And so what the beauty of that also is, what do you need to do to be better at solving that problem? You need to understand drug data better. So it has nothing to do with contracting. It has nothing to do with all these conversations that we keep having. If you want to do something like orthopedic surgery better, what do? You study all the techniques, you study all the outcomes, and you practice, right? Because you do it over and over again until you get better at it. And every time that you do it, you're trying to figure out, I want to understand this better than anybody else on the planet, because that's how I'm going to become better at orthopedic surgeries than anybody else on the planet, right?
Right.
And in the same way, if you go back and ask, what's the thing that you want to understand better than anybody else? Drug data. And then if you ask about the right person, how do we figure that out? Right? And it's like you take the same drug, you give it to two different people, right? It works for patient A, who's a responder, and patient B fails. They're a non-responder. And you're like, why? It was exactly the same drug that we gave to both people. And often we don't even know why, but some physical characteristics about person A are different than person B. And as a result, one is a responder, one is not. Again, if you go back, but what is it about person A or B? It's about their data. Are we able to change the data of person B and make them look like person A? It's like, no. Does our opinion matter between person A or B, or our opinion, is it going to change a person's data? It's like, no. It's invariant. It's intrinsic to the person, just like the data behind a drug is intrinsic to a drug. And the last piece of that, the right price, price is by definition a data problem. By definition, right? When you think about price. And in this case, it's just a question of what is available, where, who, how, and how many different ways can I get from point A to point B? It's a data problem. So if you just sat back for a second and asked, if I had to solve the problem of the right drug for the right person at the right price, what is the intrinsic domain of the problem? Data, right? And so if we started with the data, then it becomes obvious how we can get to a much simpler answer, right? Going back to sort of the complexity that we talk about on a daily basis. And as a result, you transform this problem from being in the world of contracting, business, and opinion to be able to say, hey, this is an analytic problem that's based on data. And if we can understand data better, we can do a better job of getting every person on the best drug for them at the best price.
Isn't that part of the problem, Pramod, that you have the cost of these specialty drugs with such little efficacy to boot? They don't even, most of them don't help anybody, but they're sure going to have side effects from these toxic drugs, right?
Yeah, not only that, here's a really interesting thing. I've been asking this question to people. Now I've asked hundreds of people this question, right? And it's a really simple setup. It said, hey, you've got cancer. So Steve, you've got cancer since you asked that question. And I walk up to you and I'm like, hey, this is a $250,000 a year drug. Okay. It's not going to work for you. How much are you willing to pay for it?
Zero.
Okay. So I'm going to twist the question a little bit. All right. Say, all right, Steve, you have cancer and this is a $250,000 a year drug. I promise that it will cure you. How much are you willing to pay for it?
I'll sell my house. Pay all of
Okay.
it.
Yeah.
I mean, so
right.
here's the beauty of that, right? I know it sounds like a stupid setup question. By the way, I've asked that question now to hundreds of people. Not a single American, average American who's not a healthcare expert, has ever answered that incorrectly. Everybody's gotten it right. But you remember how you started off this question with the, hey, we have drugs with poor efficacy, in this case, or effectiveness, and why are we using them because there are side effects? Here's a counterexample. You know how we just talked about everyone in America who didn't have healthcare knowledge got that question right about who would pay for a drug that doesn't work? And everyone said zero, right? Because it doesn't work. GAO, if I remember correctly, they looked at a 3-year window in which GAO found, this is Government Accountability Office looking at public sector funds. Just in Medicare alone, just in Medicare, across a small set of drugs they looked at, we had spent something like $12 billion on drugs that don't work, right? This is the Government Accountability Office saying, hey, these are accelerated approval drugs with no confirmatory trials. Some were negative after in post-marketing trials, et cetera, that we spent 12 billion. How do we, as a country, go from an answer to a question that every common person in America would have said, I can understand the answer to that question, that's stupid. Who would ever pay for something that doesn't work? And in practice, as a country, we spend billions of dollars every year on drugs that don't work. And not only that, here's the other thing that implicitly you just pointed out. It's not the drug that you're paying for. It's the outcome. Because we took exactly the same drug, and in one case, you said you would pay zero for it, and in another case, you said you would sell your house. It was the same drug that we were talking about. And it points out that implicitly, all of us really do understand that it's the outcome of the drug that we really care about. But our models for how we practice medicine, pay for medicine, formularies, how the PBM model, how all of these pieces fit together are completely disconnected from what all of us know to be true.
Right.
Pramod, I think that that's a great way to summarize the issue. And, one of the problems we face, and being someone that's in the industry and I've seen the percentage of our medical spend increase over time because of drug spend. And there's this constant battle of efficacy versus marketing. And the complexity of the information, the frequency with the drugs coming out, the efficacy, all of that is so complicated and hard to maintain your understanding of it, that it's almost nearly impossible for a physician to figure out which drug would work in the right circumstance for the right patient at the right point in time. And having seen this actually happen with my dad with cancer, a particular drug that came out, it ended up not being good for him and accelerated the cancer. So how do you see, what are the best ways to utilize the data that we have to educate the population that needs to understand this, which is the physicians who prescribe the drugs?
Hey, that is a fantastic question, Lisa, because when you think about it, ultimately, if you ask the question of who has the power of the pen in this country, and actually most countries, right? When you think about most healthcare systems, even outside of the United States, it's physicians who have the power of the pen ultimately. And if we could empower physicians, for example, to make better decisions, ultimately there are a couple of benefits, right? One is every patient in America will benefit right out of the gate. No question about that, right? And the second is that it'll also get drugs that are bad off the market. Because the problem here is that, remember, even though we spent $12 billion, right, in that small segment that we looked at the GAO, and again, that's much, much bigger than that when we look at it aggregately across all the other spaces that we're looking at. But if you were to step back and ask, what if we could have gotten American doctors just to say, that's garbage. Why would we ever prescribe this stuff? Remember, then we would have spent nothing. So the point that you're making is a really important one, which is that as much as we feel powerless about being able to answer this question, actually we have the power to do that. And the people who are most empowered to do it are actually physicians, because they have the power of the pen. And so let me go back. If you think about sort of the problems of, hey, why don't physicians prescribe? Why didn't they say no? If you think about it, you've got a couple of other issues here, right? You brought up the physicians are really busy. There's a lot of data. They're not necessarily trained on all the drug data and all of these pieces when you think about physician education, right? And with reimbursement rates decreasing, as you probably all know and you've seen in your careers, you're now being forced to spend less time with every patient rather than more time with every patient looking at the data and analyzing it on their behalf. So the way the system is structured, it goes exactly counter. So think about this for just a second. Our drug spend is going up by billions of dollars per year, right? But the reimbursements for the physicians who are supposed to make these decisions is going down. And not only that, imagine you're a doctor that got paid $200 for a visit. Every year there's pressure that that's too much. Let's crank it down. But in the same time, the drugs that you're prescribing, if you're a specialist, are going up in price by many, 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 many times what you get paid for your whole time. Every year, those things go up by an order of magnitude of what your reimbursements are. So when you think about how our payment system itself works, it is completely backwards. But if, again, let's put that aside for a second and say, like, imagine you're a physician talking about, let's talk about what not to do. One, don't take money from pharma, right? When you think about sort of one of the biggest issues right now amongst prescribers, I had my first opportunity to listen to a KOL. I've never been a key opinion leader. I've never been to one of these things. I was at a thing a few weeks ago, happened to hear from a KOL from a big pharma. KOL was talking about one of their new drugs. They started out by putting the drug data on the screen, right? And I'm looking at this. And I mean, if you had a basic understanding of drug data, you would know that their primary endpoint actually was the data behind it was very, very, very poor. That was slide number 1. Slide number 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 all had large disclaimers on the bottom that says, yeah, we didn't have a control arm, so you have to be careful about how we interpret this. Yeah, there's some other, disclaimer here because in the use of the data, it may not be fair how we're using the data. I'm like, in what other country could you put up charts like that and then try to convince a room of doctors that they should be using your drug?
Let alone commercials to the public, by the way.
Yeah. And so you've got the commercials to the public, you've got a lot of these things, but it has got to start by saying that doctors represent the American people. And at that point, it's got to start with the, hey, who do we represent? And it's got to start with that. And at that point, that frees you to say, hey, at the end of the day, my incentives are just one thing: right drug, right person, right price. What do I need to do to figure it out? And that's where, like, and again, I don't want to suggest that no one else can do this. I would suggest that everyone else should do what we're doing as a company, which is we study drug data. We try to figure out the answer to that question. And we also have a business model that states that we have no horse in this race. We don't own anything. We get paid exactly the same, whether someone's on a cheap drug or an expensive drug, makes no difference, right? Because you want independence of the business from the data behind trying to answer that question. And so our argument would be that, look, unless people start doing that, imagine you're a large hospital system. Imagine that you could be having a group of people who are focused on this, right? You could partner with an organization that's independent, like Vivio. There are a lot of things that people could do to answer that question and do a better job. Because I agree with you, doctors by themselves and the way that things are structured today, they have zero time or ability to be able to answer this question or solve it.
Yeah, Pramod, they also don't, to be fair, physicians, or maybe it's not being fair, just being truthful, physicians also don't have a clue about what anything costs. And we're not taught anything about that, nor do we see the cost. And certainly in the pharma spend space, nobody knows the true cost of anything, right? Because
That's right.
the scheme is complicated. And you know that, the PBMs, it's
Yep.
not the, I used to think the manufacturers are the ones who are taking advantage of the public. But as you, and we all know now, it's the PBMs that are taking a lot of the profit, or the distributors. And as you also know, there's only 3 companies in each of those spaces that control
That's right.
90% of that market. But so let's take it down to real world, because listen, Steve and I are old enough to remember when, ALL was a uniformly lethal disease, and now people survive with leukemia.
Yeah.
And I have a sister with lupus, and when she was diagnosed in 1981, her survival was probably 10 more years, and she's still alive because of drugs. So no one would argue that the pharmaceuticals and medications for the right patient at the right time have a role. But I actually had worked occasionally. I had about 4 or 5 years of working with the Food and Drug Administration in their microbiologic device evaluation unit. And I knew the FDA was focused on safety. I have to admit, I was somewhat stunned and shocked by the minimal efficacy that things had to have to get approved, because their focus was safety. So as long as it wasn't outright killing you, these devices that had marginal, if any, benefit, sometimes maybe a little better side effect profile or complication profile, were getting approved. So, the public, of course, doesn't know about this nuance. Nobody reads the fine print that goes onto the TV screen. The doctors are, still have drug reps going to their offices, with pizzas and pens and stuff, directly promoting the products. So let's give a real world example. So I had a hospital, right, and I had a big MS center, and I saw patients come in literally with wheelchairs and walk out as a result of the medications they got, and some physical therapy and some other things. So how does it work? So if somebody's newly diagnosed with MS and there's a host of drugs, they're all very expensive. And by the way, it's not just the cost of the drug. As you know, I would charge plenty. I might buy them at 340B pricing, charge retail, and then charge a big facility fee. It's not just the cost of the drug, right? It's where they get it and how they get it. So in that world, tell me how you visualize it working.
I add to that, Pramod, a couple of minutes ago, you used 2 words that maybe you can clarify for the listeners. You talked about efficacy and effectiveness. What's the
Right.
difference between those two?
Yeah, Steve, that's a really good question. I have to say that when I got into this a few years ago, up till then, I had no idea myself. Like most people, everybody, like, for example, like the FDA description, John, of the safety and efficacy. Everybody talks about safety and efficacy, safety and efficacy. And the safety part we all understand pretty easily. It's like, yeah, I guess it's not going to kill you, right? That part of it. But until a few years ago, when we got engaged with this venture, and our chief science officer one day explained to me what this was, I assumed, and I was equivocating efficacy with "it works," right? And it turns out that if you actually look at the technical description of efficacy, it has nothing to do with "it works." It's the population response rate.
Right.
And effectiveness is what refers to, but what does it do for you? Efficacy is the who it does it for, and effectiveness is the what does it do for that person. So let me give you a really simple example that sort of shows you the difference between the two. Again, I'm going to go to an oncology example. Imagine you had cancer and I said to you, hey, this drug has an efficacy of 90%. This drug has an efficacy of 70%. Which drug would you choose?
Right. 90%.
90%, right? Okay. Now, but I left out a really important piece of information, which is actually the piece of information that you care about. Okay, so what I just answered was that in one case, 9 out of 10 people, and in the second case, 7 out of 10 people, right? 70 versus 90. But what I failed to tell you was the drug that has a 90 will improve your life expectancy by 1 year. The drug that had 70 improves your life expectancy by 10 years. Now, do you want the 90% efficacy or do you want the 70%
Great
efficacy?
example. Yeah.
Wow.
Right.
And that's informed consent too.
And I think those are the sorts of things that happen because, when it goes back to as a patient, right? You don't care about the efficacy number. I care about, am I going to be in the 7 out of 10 that's going to live for 10 years is the only thing I care about. And that any patient should have to care about, right?
Right.
And so the problem with a lot of the use of data is that often we're not using these things correctly also, right? And so we've got to figure out ways that we can use them properly, because if we don't use them properly, then we're going to end up making the wrong decisions, giving individuals the wrong data. Because I mean, you look at that example, right? Any oncologist could have explained it in the right way. They just had to keep going, right? And
Right.
not stop at the efficacy
Right.
number, right?
Right.
But often we end up having these conversations when folks don't know the difference, that we end up having the wrong conversation, right, with the
Right.
patient, right?
Right.
And again, that's because, as you point out, a lot of them are trained. We run into physicians who actually don't know the difference between those things, right? For example, because that's not something they were trained on. So we would say, look, physicians should have basic education on all these things, right? We want them to know, we want them to understand. They will be able to make better decisions themselves, right?
Yeah.
At that point.
You know, what you're talking about too, we haven't even talked about side effects of those drugs.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, you talk about efficacy and effectiveness, but you haven't added, there's also a chance you can die of liver complications or something, right?
Well, so Steve, you bring up another really good point that we don't consider, which is, you know how when we go to trials, John, you were talking about trials. Trials don't subtract negative. As a result, it's not a net negative, right? For example, let's assume that you're in a trial in which there are 100 people and all of them live and it's an MS drug. Well, if some of those people had negative side effects, you don't have to subtract that from the benefit, from the
Right.
parties that had benefit.
Right.
So as a result, it's not a net benefit that you're looking at. It's a one-sided benefit across the actual whatever you're measuring. As a result, you could have a drug that has a net positive benefit. And I'll give you an example. Oncology drug again. I love to pick on oncology drugs because they're some of the worst offenders, right? When you think about sort of oncology, when a person is dying to begin with, often. And so breast cancer drug, in the trials, over 70% of the women who were, because it was the trial with women, FDA approved drug that people still prescribe today. And so on this drug, in the trials, there was a 70% chance that you would have between grade 3 or 4 diarrhea. And for those of you who know, that's very, very severe. I mean, like, I can't get up and walk or function kind of situation, right? And as a result, it was like there were at least 20% of the population or more that would just get off the drug because of the side effects. The drug was approved, and the net benefit was a very small benefit in potentially 2 out of 100 people. So the drug was approved on a small positive benefit for potentially 2 out of 100 people, in which 70% of the people had grade 3 or 4 diarrhea.
Crazy. Crazy.
Wow.
Yeah. It's mind-boggling. And the cancer, even when you talk about the therapeutic in some of the oncologics, to your point, the improvement is marginal at best, in the sense of we're talking, it's weeks survival sometimes. And when someone tells you about it, 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 10 weeks more, sounds, like, but then if you don't have the conversation completely about the trade-off with the side effects you're going to have, I think a lot of people would say, you know what, I'm good. I'd rather live a little more comfortably for my last few months of life and not
Well, and I think that's the quality of life discussion. Like Lisa already brought up the case of, at least I believe you brought up the case of your father, right? And in that case, you probably were never provided information on the potential that the side effects would make your quality of life for the weeks of life that you had worse. So, I mean, imagine a trade-off where you're like, I'm going to put, I mean, and by the way, oncology drugs are never quality of life improvement drugs, right? Those are other kinds of drugs that do that. If you're on an oncology drug, it is guaranteed that it's a reduction in quality of life on any sort of oncology drug that you're on, right?
Right.
And at that point, imagine that you're trading off quality of life, that you've got 6 weeks to live, and now you have such a poor quality of life that you can't even walk, and it increases it by 2 weeks versus you would have had 6 weeks to live and you would have had a pretty decent quality of life until the end. I mean, like, which one do you want?
A lot of people choose the quality for sure. Steve?
Yeah, no, let's get down and come back to the Porter and Kaplan value equation. And by the way, Professor Kaplan is an electrical engineer too, you may know, and he became a cost accountant. But let's go back to the outcomes, because in my world, relatively easy to measure. We use patient-reported outcomes, and we add some patient experience. So the numerator and even the denominator, we can use TDABC to figure out that it must be really hard in your world because we've just covered all of these variables in the numerator to talk about the ultimate outcome and forget about the true cost. How in the world would Vivio ever know the true cost of manufacturing any of the drugs we just talked about? So how do you do the analytics on this stuff?
So, I mean, when you think about it for a second, there are a couple of dimensions here, right? One of the dimensions is outcomes, right? For a second, remember we talked about that example of the nobody pays for stuff that doesn't work,
Right?
except if it's healthcare, right? I don't pay for cars that don't run. You don't pay for cars that don't run. You don't pay for the equivalent of a house that doesn't have a roof, right? Sort of thing. No, nobody does. But in healthcare, we keep paying for stuff that doesn't work, right? So imagine that the best we could do, right? If you think about the best we can do is remember how we're talking about the patient A versus B, where sometimes we don't know why one's a responder and one's not. So in those cases, the best we could do is for you to fail quickly. I mean, there are only two things in life that we can do, right? One is a priori, we've got knowledge that allows us to determine that you're patient A as a category or class, and you're a responder, or that you're a non-responder, right? And there are very few things really that we have any sort of data, because if you think about why is that? Nobody spends time on diagnostics because diagnostics never add to revenue. They can only result in reductions of market. And
Right.
as a result, at that point, there's no financial incentive because there is no money behind, there's no lobby for the American people that collects money and then runs trials or creates diagnostics or those kinds of things, right? So as
Right.
a result, there's no economic interest from the pharma community, for example, to pay for diagnostics or tests. And so at that point, then you're like, all right, in a world in which we can't know this a priori, generally speaking, because nobody will give us the data, right? They're not going to give us data from a drug trial that tells us this, right? So the best we can do is, well, then how do we fail as quickly as possible, right?
Wow.
Because in a world in which we don't know, we only got one or two options. One is either we know up front, or the second is what is the scientific experiment that we could do to as quickly as possible identify which bin are you in? Are you a responder or non-responder, right? So if you were to
Mhm.
think about it, our model in life should be how do we as quickly as possible determine if you're a physician, for example, putting someone on a drug. At that point, you're trying to figure out objectively, how do I assess whether a person is in bin A or B, right? And so, but that starts with having objective endpoints that can be measured for every patient,
Right.
right? To understand how am I going to measure whether this person is actually improving or not? And do they meet the bar, having met the bar of it being a which bin are you in question, right? And that's what we
Hmm.
do, which is why we collect, the way we try to simulate this the best we can. I mean, this is still best efforts, right? If you think about it, something is still better than nothing, what we're doing today. And best
Yeah.
efforts here is, hey, how do we collect some outcomes information that we can correlate back to allowing us to understand which bin is this person in? And it's got to be more objective than I feel better, right? Or I don't feel better, or a lot of these things we look at to say, but what are we measuring? Like, is it brain plaques? Not that that's a good measurement of anything, generally speaking. Is it, there've got to be things that we look at. Is it, for example, you brought up the MS example. So it'd be like, scores that look at daily function, right? Functional
Right.
scores that look at, hey, if a person was in a wheelchair, how does this improve their daily function, right? Across the metrics that matter from a function perspective for
Right.
somebody, right? It would be looking at those metrics that relate back to our argument is that every drug has got to do one of three things. It's got to cure something. That's number one. Goal number one is always cure, right? Goal number two, if we can't cure somebody, would be improve their life expectancy or improve their quality of life.
Right.
Right? Those would be the goals. And every metric for a drug, if you were to think about it, has got to be measurable across one of those dimensions, right? And that's why we're willing to pay for it, because it either improves quality of life, life expectancy, or cures something.
Let me segue, if I can, to something you alluded to earlier, which of course is the elephant in the room now in the pharma spend space, no pun intended, in the GLP-1 drugs. All employers are struggling with this now. What do I do? Do we include this? Or people are clamoring for it? And this is the magical drug from a pharmaceutical business, right? Oh my God, we finally got a pill to lose weight. Heaven forbid we change our lifestyle, and you got to take it forever, basically, because when you stop the drug, you gain all the weight back. And nobody talks about the side effect profile. Give us your take, if you will, in that whole GLP-1 space.
I mean, clearly what's driving the adoption of GLP-1s is weight loss. I mean, there's no question about that. I mean, if you look at as a class, GLP-1s have been around for a long time. They're not new. If you were to look at, hey, what has substantively changed the dynamics of the GLP-1 market? It's been weight loss, the weight loss indication.
Right.
Right. And so when you look at it, you see that primarily what's driving demand for it is weight loss. And of course, the manufacturers, as you probably have seen over the last 6 months, have also new trials for cardiovascular benefit, all these other things. And at some point, remember, there's a problem of causation versus correlation. And at some point, it isn't clear, right? It's not how these trials were done. Is this because people in general who've lost weight, have lower BMI, et cetera, have lower cardiovascular risk, for example, and improvement in life expectancy, et cetera. And so now you're seeing also where Medicare, they're trying to get it approved on Medicare, and a lot of things that actually have moved quite far away from sort of, hey, this was a diabetes treatment. And by the way, there are many other diabetes classes ranging from insulin to SGLT2s, GLP-1s. I mean, the list goes on, a first line, second line, third line. To be clear, it's one of the most important spaces. Right. When you think about diabetes management, because of the comorbidities and other things that diabetes can cause, it's actually a very important space.
And the total spend. We shouldn't
Right.
forget diabetes accounts for 1/4 of the $4.5 trillion spend.
Yeah, and so it's clearly a big spend, right? And it was a big spend before. But I mean, remember, you're probably seeing also just in the last few months, do you see the lawsuits that the federal government's filed, the FTC against the PBMs, and the state of Texas filed a lawsuit against both the PBMs and the pharma manufacturers, and actually for this whole game to work, the pharma manufacturers are just as much involved. I know that PBMs always get a bad rap, but remember, this game only works because there were pharma manufacturers also who were part of this game for this whole game to work.
Right.
And so they've rightfully so put a lawsuit against both the PBMs and the pharma manufacturers, basically on insulin pricing and market fixing, all the things related to sort of insulin pricing, right, in the diabetes space. And so the issue is it's a big space. It's a real space. But even before the GLP-1s came along, we've been overpaying for drugs in that space. That's what these lawsuits are not about GLP-1s. They're just about insulin, right? Which is just a basic necessity when you think about it, right? And so the more interesting thing about this is that if you think about even the GLP-1s, right? To Bernie Sanders' credit, the question that he's been asking, to Novo CEO and everybody else is, hey, why are we paying so much compared to the rest of the world, right? For the same drug.
Right.
And so if you want to walk away, one thing to walk away with, Americans are just being unfairly treated because we're refusing to say no. Going back to Porter and Kaplan, for a market to function, the most important thing is for you to have the ability to say no.
Right.
No one in this country is allowed to say no. We're only allowed to say yes. A market cannot function unless somebody says no. So if somebody comes up to us and says, as Americans, we need to pay 5 to 8 times as much as the rest of the world, well, unless Americans say, no, we're not going to pay that, well, then we're going to get what we get. And by the way, when Bernie Sanders went to the CEO of Novo and said, hey, why are you guys doing this, like compared to Europe or Denmark or all these other places, right? He said, oh, it's the PBMs. So if you carefully read the response, you will find that what they make after the PBM part of the whole equation, our calculations were it was 3 times what they're charging in Europe after you've backed out how much the PBMs are making. So Novo is still making 3 times as much, even after the PBM tax that we're all paying on top of it. But as a manufacturer, he still didn't really answer the question. He evaded the question but at the end of the day, why are you still walking away with 3 to 4 times what Denmark, England, and all these other places are paying after you back that out?
Right. Yeah, great points. Yeah, it's like the price of oil. Price of oil goes up, and then my price of the gas pump goes up the next day. It's like, wait a minute.
Right. Yeah. Isn't part of the problem political constipation? We have talked a little bit about side effects here, right? The issue around addressing the drug spend, aside from the fact that, we're willing to pay and nobody's willing to stand up and say no, as you said, is that part of our political process is funded by a lot of these entities, right? And it makes it harder for those in Washington to make the relevant decisions that are necessary to reset the way this market works. And don't you think that this is going to get way more complicated with, boutique drugs that are genetically altered to meet the certain needs of a particular patient? This has nowhere to go but worse if we don't address it now.
Yeah, 100%. You're spot on, Lisa. I mean, these things are ultimately public policy problems, right? Because if you go back and ask, well, why do we allow this stuff? I mean, we're not having this conversation about gasoline. We're not having this as much as we talk about the pump. We still pay some of the lowest prices in the world as one of the largest oil producing and exporting countries in the world. We actually pay some of the lowest prices as much as we complain about the cost of gas, right? And we look down the list of all the things and we find that we have a fairly competitive market. Like, for example, John, let's go back to your gas example. If I'm driving down the street and I see one gas station charging $5 for a gallon of gas and the gas station across on the other side charging $500 for a gallon of gas, what would happen, right? Because John, I know you're a nice guy, so you'd walk into the one charging $500 and you'd walk in and say, "Hey guys, I just wanted to help you out. I was driving by, I noticed that your decimal point fell off," right? Because that's what you'd assume, right? Because they meant 5 and the decimal point must have fallen off, right? And then they look at you and they say, "Excuse me, are you an expert in oil and natural gas pricing?" And then you're like, "No." "Are you like some sort of expert on retail and as far as wholesale pricing of fuels?" And you're like, "No." And
No.
then it's, "Why do you think you're qualified to tell us how much we should price a gallon of gas for?"
Yeah.
Right? And of course, sound familiar? And
Yeah.
then it's and by the way, you really don't understand how this works, because if you did, you would know that while you pay $500 for a gallon of gas, we sell diesel for less to all of the people who sell groceries. And do you know that as a result of you spending $500 for a gallon of gas, that lettuce costs less? And if you looked at your wallet, you'd find that your grocery bill is lower because of
I
us.
love it.
So
Yeah, I
are you
love
the
it.
economist or am I the economist?
Yeah,
Now, of
great.
course, a third grader in America would look at that and say, "That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard of in my life." Okay. But that same example, if you guys look at the J&J lawsuit, one of the examples that's used in the J&J lawsuit is a drug that Mark Cuban Cost Plus Drug sells for just under $30. Obagio. It's actually teriflunomide, generic Obagio, right? And it's $30 for a 30-day supply. And Express Scripts, J&J's PBM, through their pharmacy, sells the exact same drug for $10,000,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And all of
It's
us
just
look for
unbelievable.
ways to explain why that makes sense instead of saying, "Let's apply third grade math, people."
Yeah, yeah. Well, your gas analogy is not so crazy. Steve?
No, I was going to say that, we're chuckling at these ridiculous numbers, but let's remember the impact on our fellow citizens. I was having dinner last night with someone Pramod who said his out-of-pocket cost, had a cardiac event a year ago, was $1,200. He could pay it. And he said, "How does everybody else do it?" I said, "They don't. They don't. They don't take the drug." He said, "Well, they
So,
can't."
Steve, let's go back to that J&J example. If you did the math, because it had their co-pay and their deductible out of it, this
Right.
person was on a high deductible plan. Their out of pocket for 1 month of that drug, actual cost was $1,750. Now, if you can do basic math, you're like, "Hey, roughly $30 times 12. I could have bought a whole year of the same drug from Mark Cuban for $360.
Yeah.
Why am I being forced to
Insane.
pay $1,750 for something that I could have picked up and paid cash and paid $350 for a year for?"
Don't
1 year,
forget,
one
don't
dose.
forget, I wouldn't say that people don't pay it, to use your example, because the reality is, remember, this is the number one cause of personal bankruptcy in this country. Some people are paying it because they believe these things work and they're spending the money and they're selling their homes or mortgaging, and it's really kind of sad. It's insane, really. And I think your stat that you started with, Pramod, which I've heard you say before, and I've heard others say it too, it is crazy. We're 4% of the world's population. It's crazy when you say it out loud. It's crazy.
I know that we have these academic conversations all the time, and after a while, they just sound like just another academic conversation. But we're the people who have the power to do something. The average person in America who has to work two minimum wage jobs and have two people to make a median income in this country, they are powerless to do anything about this. And they are the ones who bear the brunt of our academic conversations. And at the end of the day, all of us have a social responsibility to do something to fix this.
With you on that.
You should be a unicorn, dude. I mean, for the work you're doing, it's the only pharma conversation I actually understand.
But I mean, not that I made it simple, it just is. I can't make it simpler than it is. This stuff is really not that complicated, right? People just make it out to be complicated because everybody benefits from all this extra complication, mumbo jumbo, jargon, and all this stuff.
Right.
Pramod, we can go on for hours. Very inspiring and enlightening conversation. Really, I have a list of questions that we'll put off for another day. But we have a tradition on this podcast as we start to wrap up to ask a special question of our guests. And I just want to preface it that, in the non-pharma world, we are seeing some bright spots, looking at outcomes, paying for quality. The question is, are you seeing that in the next 3 to 5 years? Give us some of your thoughts of where we're going to land. Are we going to move towards a Vivio model? It's going to be business as usual? Give us some of your thoughts, blue sky thinking. What do you think?
In most cases, there are some things that are intrinsic problems, like getting to Mars. And if you ask, hey, what is the complexity associated with getting to Mars? Technology and where we are, the line between our ability to get there is almost immeasurable, right? Because we just don't know even how to answer the question of could we even figure it out? But this question about whether we need to overpay for drugs or could we have a different future, right? That's not one of those problems. This is clearly in the category of, nobody got fired for IBM, so we're keeping a model alive that we don't need. We have data to show that we don't need to do this any longer. Nobody in America needs to do this PBM model thing, right? That model is dead. We have the data and everything else to prove that no one needs to do this. So what I'm trying to say is that this is one of those things of, I don't know what the answer is going to be, but it could be completely different. Nothing is stopping us from the answer being 5 to 10 years from now. We all laugh at the idea of the PBM model like the dodo. There's nothing intrinsically preventing us from getting there.
Soluble. We wouldn't disagree with that.
We can pray for that for sure.
Yeah. Pramod, thank you so much. Steve's right. We could talk to you all day, and you're brilliant. You're truly brilliant, and you have not just are you brilliant, but you're able to simplify, and I don't mean that in a pejorative sense, of very complex, but it's complex to your point because we've made it complex.
Yes.
It really shouldn't be that complicated, right? Every other part of our society, somebody makes something, you could buy it at a store, you pay a price, you pay a reasonable profit margin to the company, and we're all happy. That's the free market, right? And if it's too expensive, you're just not going to do it. Healthcare, unfortunately, in general and in the pharmaceutical space in particular, is just not a free market. And I think we all applaud the efforts to move there over time. But thank you so much for joining us. Pramod, that was great. Really appreciate it. Steve and Lisa, once again, thank you for a wonderful conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me.
Good word. Thank you, Pramod.
We want to take a minute now to introduce the new MTVA membership program. As a 501c3 nonprofit, we rely on support from our grassroots network to advance our mission of creating a value-based health system with high-quality patient outcomes at a reasonable cost. As we continue to grow and broaden our impact, we're excited to invite like-minded organizations and individuals to join our membership program. We're proud to offer 2 membership models, Ally Member and Trade Member. Tax-deductible membership contributions help us enrich the healthcare environment with quality content, including this podcast, and robust platforms to fuel discussion, collaboration, and advocacy that lead to groundbreaking solutions. For more information, including a full list of benefits offered, visit our website at www.movingtovalue.org/trade-member. The link is also in the episode description. Thanks again for listening and for being part of this important movement.